Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever wondered how a perfectly designed, rigidly tested system could look right at a massive structural anomaly and just completely ignore it? Well, today we are going to forensically dissect exactly that. We're looking at a fascinating sci-fi case study of how an absolutely flawless institutional system literally blindfolded itself to a monumental physical reality. And we'll see the catastrophic physical consequences that happened when that bad data finally met the real world.
Here is our roadmap for this case study. First, we'll look at the standard intake routine. Then we'll dive into the human data anomaly, check out the ignored first clue, break down the shattering strike itself, and finally, explore how the system had to be recalibrated.
All right, part 1, the standard intake routine. So our case study begins in the quiet evening office of Commandant Levine over at Vebon Academy. Now, Levine is an administrator who has sat in this exact post for 30 cycles, and he relies heavily, absolutely heavily, on his carefully constructed administrative rubric. He's expertly processing the intake data for this mid-cycle cohort of 43 cadets, representing 11 different alien species from across the coalition. And everything looks great. The Garnath are showing their usual reach, the Krav are dense, the Polari are light. Levine finds a lot of deep professional comfort in the fact that the numbers are behaving exactly as expected. Everything is perfectly aligned with the baselines his system has relied on for 3 decades. That brings us to part 2. The human data anomaly. So we get to the very last file of the evening. It's a diplomatic admission from the Terran delegation. A human cadet named Weissmuller, who carries the frankly highly irrelevant hereditary nickname Tarzan. Now visually, and according to almost all the metrics, this human is totally unremarkable. His height is slightly below the cohort mean, his mass is standard, his muscle density is, well, just standard. But wait. Look down at the bottom of his intake file. There is a glaring, massive anomaly hiding right there in the numbers.
4.7. That is his skeletal density index. The crucial takeaway here is that this massive number is so far beyond the expected baseline for any known coalition species, the automated intake scanner instantly throws up a red flag. Functionally speaking, this is a number that just shouldn't exist in a biological being of his size.
And this brings us to the smoking gun of our entire case study. The automated flag reads exactly that, a probable calibration artifact. The system assumed a machine calibration error where there absolutely wasn't one. Because the reading fell outside all recorded parameters, the system activated a standard protocol. And here's the kicker. It was a protocol that Commandant Line actually wrote himself 28 cycles ago. This brilliantly illustrates a systemic blind spot in action. By applying an automated averaging clause, the system completely erased the actual 4.7 reading. It quite literally blindfolded itself, replacing the hard data with a perfectly plausible but entirely fictitious normalized output of 1.4. The system couldn't comprehend the truth, so it just invented a lie that made sense. Because of this fake normalized data, Weissmuller was officially ranked 43rd out of 43 cadets in physical threat, dead last. Lane accepts its override, of course, because it's correct procedure. This mathematical fact is permanently logged into the system, and that sets a profoundly dangerous trap for anyone relying on the Academy's data.
Moving on to part 3, the ignored first clue.
Fast forward 6 weeks. We're in the austere sparring hall, and physical reality begins to quietly knock against that flawed intake data. During an otherwise totally unremarkable bout, an opponent lands a clean, well-placed strike directly on Muller's forearm. So what happens? The opponent has to step back, shaking out a bruised hand, while Muller just absorbs the hit like a brick wall. He barely even registers the impact. But the medical note just files this minor bruising away without much fanfare.
Now, Commandant Lonin is actually up in the gallery watching this happen, but look at how he rationalizes it through his unreliable narrator, his beloved rubric. He assumes the human just has really disciplined pain management, a psychological trait that fits a 1.4 density index perfectly. He completely misses the physical truth here. The opponent's hand bruised because it struck bone with a massive density of 4.7. The rubric successfully overwrote Lon's own eyes.
Which leads us straight into part 4, the shattering strike. The Academy's most decorated and physically gifted instructor, a 35-year vet named Kanahamoko, steps onto the floor. He's there to deliver an object lesson to the lowest-ranked cadet, Weissmuller. Let's really break down the biomechanics of what happens next. Kanahamoko executes a textbook, absolutely flawless lateral kick. He calculates his weight transfer, his clinical hip rotation, and his target geometry perfectly. But crucially, he calculates it for a target with an indexed bone density of 1.4. He's throwing a strike meant to humble a completely average, low-density cadet. But instead of that normal sparring thud, a horrifyingly loud noise echoes all the way up to the 30-foot gallery. And it wasn't just the sharp crack of a clean break. No, it was something with real mass and finality to it. It was the unmistakable sound of massive structural failure. The aftermath is instantaneous, and it's brutal. Mueller barely registers the blow. He treats it like a mild knock on a solid wall, making this tiny micro-adjustment and just keeping his guard up. Meanwhile, instructor Kanehimoko instantly crumples to the floor. His leg is completely destroyed from striking what was, biologically speaking, a solid anvil. As the sparring hall falls into this deeply textured silence of shocked, unwilled recalculation, Lean is just racing through the physics in his mind. The angle was correct, the force was appropriate, the technique was literally flawless, so how on earth did it fail? Then, Lane realizes. The calculation was right, which means the variables he was fed must have been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, Recalibrating the System. Following this massive incident, medical dictates Kanehimoko is going to need a minimum of 16 weeks just to heal, and his leg will probably ache in bad weather for the rest of his life. Prompted by this total systemic failure, Lane launches a quiet forensic investigation. He pulls the scanner's calibration logs for that specific intake day. He cross-checks the Garnots, the Krevs, the Polari. He runs a scanner drift analysis, and the conclusion is absolute. The hardware hadn't malfunctioned at all. It accurately recorded 4.7. The machine was simply speaking a truth that the administrative system couldn't comprehend. Lane finally finds the fatal flaw sitting right there in Section 7 of his own rubric. It was a clause he wrote himself 28 cycles ago. It stated that any extreme data point exceeding 2.5 standard deviations was automatically assumed to be an impossible machine error and was erased. He wrote it assuming his baseline knowledge was absolute. And this perfectly captures the paradox we're talking about today. The rubric forced the raw data to comfortably match the visual assumption of the eye. Lane built what he truly thought was a solid quality control measure to prevent bad data from entering the system. But in reality, it functioned as a dangerous institutional blindfold that completely hid an incredible reality. Realizing that the data and reality were actually perfectly aligned this entire time, Lane immediately deletes his old averaging clause. He rewrites the protocol entirely, mandating that from now on, extreme readings must be preserved, unmodified, and cross-referenced. The system literally had to be expanded to accept that the flag itself wasn't a mistake. The flag was the discovery. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and it leaves us with a truly critical thought to carry forward. How often do we force extraordinary, anomalous reality to fit comfortably within our standard expectations? Seriously, what unquestioned assumptions are acting as invisible blindfolds within your own flawless systems? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating breakdown with me. Keep questioning your data, and I'll catch you next time.